is Ted Geier, who is a doctoral candidate in consulate at UC Davis, working on non-humans and British Romantic literature, law, and culture, including economic and cultural histories of meat production and other consumptions of animals during the Smithfield market and animal rights debates. Ted, what?
Is there any way of getting some air in here?
I could open the window. Oh, it's open. How the hell am I supposed to follow that? That was fantastic.
Yeah.
I love what you guys are doing with the exchanges. I mean, fantastic. Yeah.
I'll just finish introducing them.
Oh, sorry.
No, are you ready?
Yeah, I'm set. Nope, don't need it.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. You're just using them. All right.
So I'm totally charmed by this event, this kind of hybrid event, right? And I'm really, really thrilled to be on this panel, even more so now. I already was, right, with all these different species of address. I really can't wait for the film. And I've also kind of liked the academic, personal attestation, these different styles. So I've kind of taken that up, and I had a brief conversation with Harlan before all of this as well. And I've tried to strive away from a densely annotated or really aggressively argued paper. But I think my biases and my presumptions are going to come through once my behavior is kind of out in the room. At any rate, I'm going to be conducting research in London this summer on Smithfield Market and its removal, and on interspecies communities articulating the London city space during its life as a live meat market. And this is part of a larger project, my dissertation on British literature from 1780 to 1911, in relation to a more formal coverage of major animal rights debates in parliaments and animal law. So I'm really interested in material collaborative histories of animals in London and in the Smithfield meat network, as well as other consumptive modes. But today, I'm mostly interested in the possibilities suggested by repeated instances of frustrated interspecies communication and concern in British Romantic works. My title for this is really just a figure of speech, or a turn of phrase. It's a conditioned comportment toward a frustrated but unmistakable consubstantiality. The impulse for interspecies community, often in shared suffering, which I think deserves to be interrogated and tested further on its own terms, actually. Is this a romantic neurosis? What does it mean to share? But this impulse returns again and again, and has been the source of one of my own most deeply felt affinities for the genre, such that I cared enough to try to become a scholar of it. Despite repeated failures or fragmentary encounters, authors attempt again and again to resist categorical inventories of objects and species, and try everywhere to address non-humans while evaluating the violence of address in many cases as well. And I'm thinking here also of the radical unreliability of narration in the frame structures of Frankenstein, or even of Dracula, which is a bit later, but I think still relevant. I'm also thinking of even the most prototypically misanthropic epic wanderer of a Byron pilgrimage or a Wordsworth excursion. The human is always somehow in question in romantic works. So as a romanticist or a Britishist in training, parentheses in training, it's really something to get put in my place on a place panel. I can't help but feel that sometimes in some sorts of discussions, place is denigrated as a sort of provincial, closed-minded authenticity game that is always asserting itself defiantly against the thicker networks and the larger scales of enmeshment that some strains of properly ecological thought on global eco-cosmopolitical themes expect. This charge, however, may be right in the case of a Wordsworth, who of course catalogued the Lake District in England and helped to usher in an Angloid narration of placey ecology, enjoyment, and aesthetic experience and use, that yet strikes resonant chords on issues of shared environment and animal experience, and even on the secret lives of plants, thinking maybe of his stuff on consumer commodities of propertied place like the lawn. But he also, with Coleridge, crafts lyrical ballads in 1797 as part of a broad public social critique of the poor laws, among other things. And this is only the tip of the iceberg for the period's social engagement. But then there are folks like Robert Burns and John Clare, who spend the majority of their poetic lives lamenting enclosure, cultural disruption, and the suffering of birds, badgers, and others. And they narrate sentimental and non-sentimental losses of places that seem to ruin things for all critters equally. What drew me initially to romantic literature, however many years ago it was the response of folks like Charlotte Smith, Clare, Burns. Coleridge has a poem, To a Young Ass, about an abused laboring animal, to this problem of suffering. Clare writes, the badger, right as bans on badger baiting passed through British Parliament. Burns, I think, is riveting in To a Mouse, which is narrated chiefly in the Scottish dialect, that is both estranged from its English milieu, while also in agreement with other English narrations. The narrator cannot quite appropriate and articulate the clear behavior of suffering on the part of a mother mouse turned up in a field the tiller narrator is working, but stops everything in the place of agrarian dailiness to mark it, to address it, to mourn it and attend to the trouble with agriculture and landed economies, none in the poem can ameliorate or negotiate beyond attention and testimonial. The apology, I'm truly sorry man's dominion has broken nature's social union, a famous line. But the narrator cannot narrate the mouse's suffering or explain that failure is a gripping human suffering in the poem as well. The poem is a narrated object in total terror, such as it can be, but the narrator marks the impeded sharing and cannot imagine what it's like to be a mouse, if you will, before simply plowing ahead and gathering mice and men in shared suffering. Burns' diminutive phrases in the poem are worth evaluating, but the primary impulse and general theme of frustrated human endeavor, in conjunction with Burns' lifelong resistance to English linguistic and cultural hegemony, strike a measured blow against a too quickly flattened space of inclusion that elides or erases in productive consumption in the case of tillage, Scottish and animal places alike. In another version of this impulse, one of my favorites, Charlotte Smith, Wordsworth's favorite too actually, Charlotte Smith roasts the prospect view and scientific catalogues of natural history in Beachy Head. And all those human efforts to lay hands on nature and critters wash away with the tide or are forgotten in an unapproachable but still narrated, this is something Wordsworth borrows from Charlotte Smith actually, a still narrated place, a watery cave at the foot of the Beachy Head Cliff, which incidentally is now one of the most popular suicide locations in the entire world, anecdotally. But I don't think it would be quite fair to say that romantic interspecies impulse always ends in total frustration, even as the crafty forms of de-anthropocentrism in the period build an impressive case against general human hubris. There is also the fact of communities of non-suffering, and think maybe, in an interesting turn perhaps, the owls in Wordsworth's canonical There Was a Boy. They don't need to be responding directly to a dead boy's narrated past to be being themselves, and also to be being past and possibly dead. These again are narrated non-existent objects in a way. The failed mimic hootings are in fact the ironic valence of interspecies non-human consubstantiality in this poem. The narrator begins with formal apostrophe, which is the romantic trope par excellence perhaps. There was a boy, ye knew him well, ye cliffs and islands of Winander. Already in this personifying trope of address to a so-called inanimate object, humans are considering their place in an act of mourning at a funereal. The poem closes with the narrator standing next to the grave of a boy. After narrating his life and interspecies, interobjective, nature-y valley boy romps and efforts at interspecies communication, this is the famous trick of many Wordsworth poems, and he gets it from Charlotte Smith in some ways, to narrate a non-thing, to narrate a non-place. So the ghostly long halloos of the owls, the boy, are the imaginative non-thing. The onomatopoeia is a recollection/speculative narration of the boy's interspecies intercourse with the watery, rocky place. It was a seductive excursion into what interspecies intercourse would be as if it were possible. But what is really dominant in the work, after the fact of reading outside the space of the poem, is the fruitless, hollow apostrophe of the presumably older and wizened narrator in address to the remaining cliffs and islands. It doesn't work out. So apostrophe, I think it's surely a speaking to one's self, and romantics can be prone to large, egotistical bouts of staged melancholy. Sometimes these are really funny, indeed, like Victor in Frankenstein. It's terrible, but it's hilarious. But the impulse itself is not necessarily always reflexive and ironic. Marjorie Levinson has written on romantic literature as a generally fragmentary genre. Even when the poems themselves are not aggressively performing framed epistolary or multiple forms that resist total articulation. This failed expression becomes the theme of much romantic literature, but then also a remarkable success. This theme can stand out as it does, for example, in Percy Shelley's brief poem on ruined monuments, Ozymandias, that yet communicate and interpolate, and in the course of this, Shelley also manages to critique imperial removal of objects from colonized lands for leisurely consumption at the British Museum. This is the famous poem of the shattered visage out in the sands. The poetics are really interesting too, but we've got 12 minutes that I'm already going to go over, so I'll skip that for now. Apostrophe tends to be closed with exclamation marks. Right? In Blake's Book of Fell, an earlier work, a young girl addresses a cloud, a worm, and finally a clod of dirt. And these address her as well, with the characteristic O aperture, like, oh, worm. She whines the whole poem, basically. And so Blake gathers humanoids and non-humanoids together in their clunky mannered addresses to things that are not there. Fell is seeking answers to her questions about finitude and life's meaning in these addresses, but this one fails too. The human, it's a virginal angloid actually, or angeloid maybe, but at least humanoid against non-humanoid before a weird leveling in the poem's final stanza when Thel is in the ground, in her own grave, as though you could witness this, right? And then think about it. The human is humiliated and runs home to mommy, away from the terrible places she is not at home in. This form of address tends to be seen as a mode of working on the human speaker. There are not exactly interlocutors in this figure. But a hallmark romantic text that I've already mentioned it, one that also employs the sentimentalist modes that Dr. Haraway was provocatively affirming in comments last night, revises apostrophe almost constantly. I think we could say, in fact, that Frankenstein is precisely a prolonged meditation on the radical strangeness of the iterative I in discourse, and further, that it seeks only to frustrate the interpersonal, interspecies, interobjective, intermaterial, interspiritual, to take seriously one of my teachers, Marisol de la Cadena, and other teachers who have spoken here already, on indigenous cosmopolitics. As creatures interpolate a speechless horror reduced time and again to baseless, empty frames for them, for Victor, right? Like devil and evil, vile beast, infernal kind of whatever, just wandering off. But never accomplishing the intimacy all forms seem intensely to desire and seek out throughout the written work, and often using calculative reason. It's a strange kind of recovery, actually. This thereby also exposes the vacancy of terminological frameworks these characters attempt to assert upon worlds they struggle to attend to. So the theme of romantic interspeciesism, then, is the impossible apostrophe. And this is borrowing from a conversation I just really had this week with David Wood, who visited us at Davis for a really kind of exciting workshop. The impossible part, not the romantic part of the apostrophe part. But this is what cannot be done but must be done. And I think we've probably heard this before in other renditions. So Wood is working out an aesthetic theory that subverts crisis environmentalist urgent calls to action that do nothing but reinvigorate a sense of incapacity or of woundedness, that rearticulates all of the object equipment of propriety, capability, wellness, realness, human. We could go on with this list, right? The expression of shared suffering, which is a failure the moment it supposes total articulation and presentation of its concept, is really in the ellipses in Ozymandias, which are sometimes actually taken out. It depends on which edition you're looking at. But very early on, there's a sort of strange ... and we're already into a really aggressively framed narrative style of reportage, right? Lots of different speakers. It gets very difficult to track who's speaking and who's recalling and what's going on. And he starts that early. Maybe, though, the turds that Carlos Williams brings up, that Dr. Diane was mentioning last night, is another version of this, right? These are, I think, the key part. So romantic interspeciesism is not failed address, but it's a constant address to the fact that verbal or nonverbal address can never thoroughly appropriate or access. And this also marks, I think, haptic sibilance and the difference that yet remains and maybe must remain to be rightly critical and attendant. The sense of reflexive materiality in this mode seems of particular interest to the modernist or the postmodernist, if not also being the dominant impetus, right, for a reaction from the realist or the naturalist's exhaustive efforts to catalog and report on suffering or undeterminate impossibility in the hopes that the message will get across somehow. I'm almost done. This is a particularly troubling problem in the case of the most often anthologized John Clare poem on the badger. And it's often anthologized missing the first and last stanza. This is a real, unintended, determined failure. I think David Perkins may present some explanation of this mystery in his book on animal rights in romantic literature, but I'm not totally recalling it at the moment. Anyway, a standard publication trend begins the poem with, "When midnight comes, a host of dogs and men go out and track the badger to its den." After various tortures and assaults, celebrations and hellos by boys and men and bulldogs, they kind of go running through the streets yelling and screaming. And the bulldog is the baiter of choice in England, bred for it at one point in fact. This is a troubled ethnography that Clare is not working through in the slightest. The dogs are complicit terrorists in the poem. There's no critical thinking on this. They're part of the society that is terrorizing the wild animal, right? But interestingly, going to make it a non-wild animal. And there's a problem here, I think. I think we could theorize this a bit further than Clare seemed to be, but it's still, I think, really insightful on its own terms. It continues, "He falls as dead and kicked by boys and men, then starts and grins and drives the crowd again. Till kicked and torn and beaten out he lies, and leaves his hold and crackles, groans, and dies." It's a very final finish. It's not how the poem usually ends, though. The badger had been taken from his home and forced to perform as badger, capital B badger, the constructed terrible beast, but also, in Clare's words, vital and noble maybe, and clever, and in charge of the action in important ways, late in the manifest. So I'll skip a full reading, but I'll give you a bit of the start of the stanza that's often not included. The badger grunting on his woodland track with shaggy hide and sharp nose scrounged with black, roots in the bushes and the woods and makes a great high burrow in the ferns. Already thinking of beavers again, actually. With nose on ground, he runs an awkward pace, and anything will beat him in the race. Screw it, I'm going to read the whole thing. The shepherd's dog will run him to his den, followed and hooted by the dogs and men. The woodmen, when the hunting comes about, go round at night to stop the foxes out. And hurrying through the bushes, ferns, and brakes, nor sees the many holes the badger makes, and often through the bushes to the chin breaks the old holes, and tumbles headlong. And these just kind of ridiculous men and dogs, right? Everybody's an idiot but the badger at the poem. Then the poem introduces this covert midnight operation. I'm picturing like everybody's dressed in black, and they've got their equipment to go get the badger, right? But there's also a brief bestiary of fox, goose, poacher, hare. They all flee the scene as the posse captures the baiting badger. And Claire's always interested, actually, in these kind of marginalized laborers out in the wilds. 0 minutes. Thank you very much. This is the end. So the poem ends then with this something more unsettling than the death of the single badger, and really the feigned death, personified with a grin, prefigures the feigned ending of the abridged poem. What happens after the death is that we get another badger. Another beaver. We get more beavers. Beavers who are domesticated. Beavers who are recurringly brought in to be this role. And it ends, he licks the patting hands, this is the badger, and tries to play, and never tries to bite or run away, and runs away from noise in hollow trees, burnt by the boys, to get a swarm of bees. So the badger, dead in one rendition, is still just a plaything for the humans in the actual version of the poem. I'm out of time. That's it. Thanks very, very much.